Hey world history students, time for another lesson. Well, things have been building up in European history, and the last time we were together we talked about this age of enlightenment where some smart people throughout Europe are starting to question the authority of monarchs and the church and stuff. Well, things come to a head in 1789 in France. Now, to let you know what's going on in our country, this is after the American Revolution. The American Revolutionary War ended in 1781, and the King of France actually helped the United Colonies, the colonies, become the United States by loaning us troops and money and a navy to help beat the British. And the king of all of this going on in France was King Louis the 16th. Here he is, right here. In 1789, Louis was about 36 years old, and he was married to the youngest daughter of Queen Maria Theresa of Austria. Her name was Marie Antoinette, a very beautiful young lady. Now, Louis and Marie got married when they were teenagers. Louis was about 16 or 17, and Marie was about 14 years old. And they were not king and queen immediately. A couple of years later, his great-grandfather passed away, and the throne passed on to King Louis the 16th, and they were running France, living in Versailles in the lap of luxury. All the luxurious things that had been set down by Louis the 14th and Louis the 15th, these two were enjoying so much fun, so much luxury. They were spending so much money. But the French treasury was running out of money. And the only way they could get more money is if they taxed the people of France. Now, just like in England, where they have parliament to vote on taxes, in France, they had a governing body known as the Estates Générales. If you remember that, we studied it a long time ago. But the Estates Générales had not been called in to vote on anything for almost 100 years. And now Louis needs some money, so he needs to get them together. So he calls them all to their government buildings to vote on some new taxes so he can have some money. And the first estate was made up of the clergy. They got together and voted on taxes. The second estate was made up of all the nobility, the people who had royal titles like baron or count or duke or prince, all those people. And the third estate was composed of everybody else in France. Now, I might have told you this before, of all the people in France, the clergy made up about 1% of the total population of France. The nobility made up about 2% of the total population of France. Now, if you can do your math, you'll notice that the common people are represented in a third group, and it's about 97% of the people in France are represented by the third estate. This is really lopsided. And what would usually happen when they vote on the tax, the clergy, the church had money, they would always vote yes. The nobility, well, most of the time they would vote yes. But the people who were paying most of the taxes, they would vote no on the taxes. And the king would look at all of it and say, well, that's 2 yeses to 1 no. Too bad, guys. The yeses win, and we will have a new tax. After the third estate started meeting and voting on these, they knew the taxing was not going to go in their favor. So they got a little creative and decided to meet on their own in a secret group that they called the National Assembly. So they could figure out there's got to be a better way to run this country than the way it has been in the past, this old regime that is just not really making any sense anymore. So they met illegally. Now, they couldn't go to the National Building where they usually met, so they ended up meeting on a big tennis court, and they all swore an oath, the tennis court oath. And they said they would keep meeting until they could figure out a better way to run France and convince the king and the queen to go along with the idea. Now, when Louis heard of this National Assembly, and it was hard to keep it a secret, he started to fear for his life and for the life of his family because he thought it might turn violent. Actually, the National Assembly was willing to hear anything that Louis was ready to contribute to making France a better country. But Louis started gathering his troops from around France. And he did something kind of unusual. He hired some mercenaries, some soldiers from hire, all the way from Switzerland to come marching up to Paris to help guard him and his family at Versailles. When the people of Paris learned about these Swiss troops coming up from Switzerland, and they heard about all the other French troops gathering in Paris, they started to worry too. They thought the king was going to turn violent against his own people. So the people of Paris formed a mob, and they wanted to get some weapons to protect themselves. And there was a place they could get the weapons. In the heart of Paris was an old fortress that had been reformed into a prison, and it was known as the Bastille. Actually, in French, they say Bastille. we Americans say Bastille. So the Bastille was this big fortress where they kept political prisoners, and they also had an armory there, an arsenal with some weapons and some gunpowder and bullets. And the French people in Paris thought, we're going to get those. And so they got together and they started marching across the street to get into this fortress. And it was on July 14th, 1789. Well, the guards that were guarding on the top of this wall, they heard about it, and they got the warden of this prison. They said, we think we're under attack. What do we do? He said, get on the walls and fire a volley at these people and scare them back. So they did. They fired a volley at these people, and some people were hit, and they fell back across the street. But they were very determined, so they regrouped a second time and charged the Bastille again, waving their picks and their axes and their pitchforks and everything they had, maybe a few swords here and there. There were men and women doing the charging, and the guards on the wall of the fortress fired a second time and killed a bunch of people, and they fell back again. And as they're regrouping for yet another advance, they could hear a drum roll and they could hear marching feet coming, and they looked down the street, and here was a battalion of French soldiers marching down the street. And suddenly the Paris mob thought, oh, this is the end of us now. We have them firing up there. These people will be firing us over here. But when the soldiers got closer, they said, no, we want to help you. You're our brothers and sisters, our mothers and fathers and cousins. We want to help you with this. And so these soldiers in the street helped charge the Bastille yet another time, and they got into the courtyard, and within a few moments they had taken over the entire prison. They captured the commandant, and they executed him, and they chopped his head off and put it on a pike, and they marched around the streets of Paris, and they felt like they were pretty victorious, and they were making a statement to the king. When the king heard about this, he was back in Versailles, about 11 miles away. He said, what's going on? And his servant said, it's a revolution, Your Highness. I'm afraid you're going to have to pay attention now. And this day, July 14th, is known as Bastille Day in France. It is their Independence Day. So we have all our fireworks and all our parades on July the 4th. They have July the 14th for their Independence Day. A few short weeks after the Bastille fell, a huge group of people marched all the way to Versailles. Most of them were women, and they surrounded the Palace of Versailles, and they demanded that Louis and Marie come to Paris and help deal with the problems in the government. Now, Louis and Marie were very, very frightened at this time. They didn't know what to expect, but they thought if we cooperate, maybe everything will be all right. So they took all their children and they went to Paris. Now, they were being held prisoner, but they got to stay in their summer palace in Paris. It was a place called the Tuileries. And they were living comfortably, but they were guarded. They could not leave their palace for any reason, except every day a carriage would come and pick up Louis and take him to the National Assembly to hear all the voting. Well, he hated it so much because it was like it was taking his power away from him. And after weeks and weeks of debating, Louis was forced to sign the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen of France. It's not like their Declaration of Independence. It's more like their Magna Carta, where they say we have certain rights that no king or queen can ever take away from us. And they also made him sign a temporary constitution to ensure those rights until they could figure out what kind of government they wanted to proceed with in their country. And Louis was scared, and he was kind of worried. He didn't quite understand what was going to happen, but he didn't want to lose his life, so he went along with what they were saying. And then the National Assembly decided, well, we are not an accurate representation of all the people in France. We were just the common people. We have to represent the nobility and the clergy too. So we need to disband and form a different group. The National Assembly disbanded, and a new group was formed. It was called the Legislative Assembly. Just like our legislative branch, it was a representation. They had officials elected throughout all of France to come to Paris to represent the different peoples from all over their nation and try to figure out what kind of country France is going to become. And there were three political groups in this big meeting hall that they had in France. There was a group known as the Conservatives. The Conservatives did not like change. They wanted France to remain a monarchy and keep the king on his throne. There was a group that wanted a lot of change. They were known as the Radicals. They wanted France to be a republic, just like this new country across the ocean, the United States of America. We thought we can do that too. And then there was another group who didn't quite know how to go. They were like, well, can't we do a little bit of both? Can't we do like England has? England has a constitutional monarchy. maybe we can have both. And when you walked right into the front doors of this big meeting hall, you always knew where the conservatives were, because when you walked in, you turned to the right, and that's where the conservatives were. And if you turned to the left, that's where the radicals were. And if you walked straight across the hall, on the other side was a big seating area where all the moderates, they were in the middle. And that's where we get the expression right-wing conservative and left-wing radical, because they sat on the right and on the left as you walked through the door. Well, Louis and Marie were very worried, because it looked like the radicals were going to win out, and they had no idea what the future would hold for them if France became a republic. So they planned an escape. There were some people in France very loyal to the crown, and so they planned one night, in the middle of the night, to dress like common people, get in one of their carriages, and ride off towards the border of France, hoping to get into the Holy Roman Empire. Now, they wanted to get there because, remember, Marie Antoinette's brother is now the King of Austria. He's actually the Holy Roman Emperor, and he is very sympathetic. He's worried about his little sister, what's going to happen to her. And so Marie and Louis and their family are riding like common people through the night, and they're riding, trying to get to the border of France. After riding for a couple of hours, the horses were getting tired, and everybody could use a break. So they took a break. They pulled over to a little roadside inn, and it was very late at night, and they knocked on the door, and the tavern owner came to the door. He's like, what do you need? And they go, we're hungry, we want to eat. And so he sat them down in his empty little restaurant, and they paid for their food, and the tavern owner went back to his counter, and he looked at the money that they gave him, and he looked at the picture on the money, and he's like, hey, where have I seen this face before? Oh, it's that guy sitting right over there. The king is in my tavern. And they're not supposed to be here. They're supposed to be in France. So this tavern owner woke up his son and told him, go get the constable. And within a few moments, some police officers were there, and they captured the king and queen and their family and took them back to Paris again. Had they not stopped, they might have made it all the way to the border and got their freedom. And it's too bad, too, because a few short weeks later, France decided it would become a republic. Now, since France was going to be a new republic, the big question was, what's going to happen to Louis and Marie? And there were some people in the government who thought, well, we need to be sympathetic. These are human beings. We can't just get rid of them. But there was a bigger group who thought, no, as long as these two live, there's always going to be a threat that they will try to regain their power and regain their thrones. And as long as they live, there will be a certain number of people living in France who will always be sympathetic to the crown, because that's all they've ever known. They don't understand what a republic is supposed to be. So they decided that Louis and Marie should lose their lives. Louis and Marie both went to this new execution device invented by a doctor to be more humane, because it's fast, called the guillotine. You laid your body down on the board, and your head went through that nice little hole, and then this weighted blade came down. It didn't chop, it's angled. It would slice your head off as it came down. And so Louis and Marie both met their fates. They were both beheaded by the guillotine. And their children were actually, two of their children got out of France, and their oldest son just kind of disappeared in history. We have no idea what really happened to him. He was taken away by a jailer, and some people think he was beaten to death or starved to death. And some people think that he made it out of France. About 30 years after this, there were about 3 or 4 people popping up in Europe saying, I'm the royal prince. No, I'm the royal prince. There was even an American, a famous American named John James Audubon, who started a bird society. He painted birds, and he said, I'm the prince. I'm the crown prince. The Dauphin, that's what you call the crown prince of France, the one who's in line to be the king. But pretty much people think that he probably got sick and he died. But now the monarchy's over, and we have a republic. Unfortunately for this new republic, everybody else in Europe is watching, and they are afraid for what's going to happen. All of the nations that surrounded France were very, very worried, because there had never been a republic in Europe, and they thought, well, what would happen if it was successful? What if France's republic was actually successful? What would happen to our countries? It might stir up our people in our countries to start revolutions too. So Austria, Prussia, Portugal, Spain, and Great Britain they formed a coalition. A coalition is when you get together with someone you don't normally get along with, but you put your differences aside so you can have get rid of a bigger problem. Well, the big problem now is France. So all 5 of these countries simultaneously declare war on this new French Republic at the same time. Well, this new French Republic has 3 branches, just like our republic: a legislative, a judicial, and an executive branch. And there are all kinds of people. I mean, the French are arguing left and right. How is this going to be run? How is it going to be run? How are we going to fight all these countries that are attacking us? And they thought, we can't just get rid of the king and queen. We have to get rid of any trace of nobility left in this country, because someone's going to step up and go, well, the king's dead, but I was his first cousin. I should be the next king. Or no, I'm his grandnephew. I should be the next cousin. So this fella comes onto the scene. His name is Maximilien Robespierre, and he becomes the Secretary of Public Safety. And he decides we have to erase anything that has to do with this old monarchy, anything of the old royal families. And so he began what is known in history as the Reign of Terror. And they went around arresting anybody with noble titles, and if anybody argued with him, he would arrest them too. Within the course of a few short months, about 40,000 French people were executed by the guillotine. This Reign of Terror was such a horrible time in French history. So many innocent people were dying for no reason at all. You had to be careful of whose side you took. And with Robespierre, he wanted to create a republic, and he wanted equal power, but he was doing so much commanding that people were suspicious of him. They thought he was getting too much power, like he was going to become a dictator and take over the country. It didn't take long for a group of people in the government to start looking at him as being the new threat to their freedom, and they tried to arrest him. He tried to commit suicide. One of his friends was with him, and he took a pistol and shot himself in the head. Robespierre took his pistol out and put it in his mouth and fired it, but the bullet it went out the other side and broke his jaw in the process. They came in and they grabbed him and they arrested him, and they took him and put him on trial. Within a day, he got his head chopped off too. But they weren't really nice. There's some conflicting stories as to how he was executed. Some people say they just did it the regular way. They put him in the guillotine, and there was a predominant story that said no, since he was responsible for so many people dying, they put him in the guillotine with his head up this way so he could see the blade coming down at him. And that was the end of his life, and the Reign of Terror was over. Now France has got to figure out how are they going to fight off 5 different countries. But fortunately, a great hero comes to the forefront. His name is Napoleon Bonaparte, and we'll talk about him the next time we get together. We'll see you really soon.